George Harrison, born on February 25, 1943 in Liverpool, England, was never the loudest member of the Beatles, but his impact on the band and the world of music is undeniable. Known as the quiet Beatle, George was often overshadowed by the more prominent personalities of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but his journey was much more than that of a passive contributor. From his early days as a teenager in Liverpool to his eventual role as a solo artist and spiritual seeker, Harrison's life was filled with moments of brilliance, frustration, and quiet rebellion. Despite being a key figure in the creation of some of the most iconic music in history, George's inner turmoil, especially with McCartney, remained largely hidden from public view. This quiet bitterness, however, was real and lasted long after the band's breakup. The early days, a teenage guitarist's dream. George's musical journey began in the streets of Liverpool in the early 1960s, where he met Paul McCartney on a school bus. Sharing a passion for rock and roll, the two formed a bond that would eventually lead to George joining John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, in 1958 at just 15 years old. Lennon, initially unsure of George's age and experience, was eventually convinced to take him on after George played the lead guitar part to Raunchy during a bus ride. From that moment, George was inextricably linked to the formation of the Beatles. However, even from the outset, it was clear that Lennon and McCartney were the dominant forces in the group. George, though immensely talented, found himself in the shadow of his more assertive bandmates. Struggling for space. The quiet Beatle. As the Beatles ascended to global stardom, George Harrison earned the moniker the Quiet Beatle. While the press romanticized his introverted nature, those close to him saw the growing frustration beneath his calm demeanor. George was a gifted guitarist and songwriter, but his contributions were often sidelined in favor of Lennon and McCartney's prolific partnership. Despite his musical prowess, he struggled to have his songs and ideas fully recognized. As time passed, the resentment began to grow. George later confessed that Paul's perfectionism often overshadowed his own creative input, and at one point, he admitted that Paul ruined him as a guitar player, not out of malice, but from the constant micromanagement. This simmering frustration would become a defining feature of George's relationship with McCartney. The White Album and the breaking point. By the time the Beatles began recording their seminal White Album in 1968, George had become a much more confident and ambitious songwriter. He no longer wanted to be just a sideman in the band. He had something to say. The tension in the studio during this period was palpable. McCartney had assumed a de facto leadership role, often taking control of the band's direction, while Lennon was distracted by his relationship with Yoko Ono. The atmosphere in the studio became increasingly strained, and one of the most telling moments came during the recording of Two of Us in 1969. In a now infamous exchange, Paul tried to direct George's guitar part, prompting George to coolly respond, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." This wasn't sarcasm, but a moment of resignation, a sign that George was done being sidelined. George's resignation and temporary departure. By January 1969, tensions had reached their breaking point. During the recording sessions for Let It Be, George temporarily quit the band. His frustration had been building for years, and Paul's controlling behavior was the final straw. George returned to the group after just a few days, but the damage had been done. His time with the Beatles had become emotionally draining, and the once harmonious camaraderie had been replaced by a bitter sense of resentment. Despite this, George was able to channel his frustrations into some of his most enduring work. Songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun emerged from this period, showcasing his exceptional songwriting talent when given the space to shine. The Beatles breakup, a personal divide. The official breakup of the Beatles in 1970 was not just a professional split for George Harrison, it was a deeply personal one. While much of the media attention was focused on the rivalry between Lennon and McCartney, George's emotional ties to the band had been quietly unraveling for years. The growing divide between him and Paul was especially painful, as George had once looked up to Paul as a musical mentor. With the release of All Things Must Pass in 1971, George finally stepped into the spotlight as a solo artist. The album was a creative and commercial triumph, but it also contained biting reflections on his experiences within the band. Songs like Wah Wah were seen as direct comments on the emotional noise George had endured during his time with the Beatles, particularly his frustrations with Paul's controlling nature. The aftermath. George's continued struggles. The legal battles and emotional fallout following the Beatles' breakup only intensified George's frustrations. Paul McCartney's decision to initiate a lawsuit to dissolve their partnership was seen by George as a final betrayal. While the other band members focused on their solo careers, George continued to wrestle with the emotional scars from his time with the Beatles. His relationship with Paul had deteriorated to the point where even his ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, later noted that George never truly liked Paul's personality. The bitterness between the two continued to simmer throughout the 1970s and 1980s, even when they occasionally attempted to collaborate again. However, George remained distant and often resistant to Paul's involvement in his solo work. A quiet reflection. The strained reunion. In 1994, the Beatles reunited for the Anthology project, which brought the surviving members together to complete John Lennon's unfinished demos. This reunion, while a moment of nostalgia for many fans, was fraught with old tensions. George still found himself at odds with Paul, often rolling his eyes when Paul would take charge of the proceedings. Though the media portrayed the reunion as a healing moment for the surviving Beatles, insiders noted that the old dynamics were hard to shake off. George's quiet frustration with Paul's domineering tendencies never fully disappeared, and the bond between the two was never as strong as it once had been. In private, George admitted that while he could work with John again, he could not work with Paul in the same way. The final years, a legacy of quiet resilience. By the late 1990s, George had largely distanced himself from the spotlight. He had become a respected solo artist, a philanthropist, and a spiritual seeker. Despite the pain and frustration that marked his years with the Beatles, George had found peace in his personal life, especially through his spiritual practices and love for Indian philosophy. Yet, the emotional wounds from his time in the band remained, and his final interviews were marked by a quiet reflection on his past. In a 2001 Yahoo chat, when asked if Paul still annoyed him, George responded with a Victorian proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was a subtle but pointed remark, indicating that while George had moved on in many ways, the past still lingered in his heart. The end of the road. George's passing and final words. In 2001, George Harrison passed away after a battle with cancer. His death, while deeply mourned by fans and loved ones alike, was not marked by grand reconciliations. Paul McCartney visited George in his final days, and the two shared a quiet moment together, holding hands and reflecting on their shared history. Paul later described this moment as a peaceful reconciliation, though George's final words, "Love one another," hinted at a complexity in their relationship that remained unresolved. Even in death, George Harrison's legacy was not only defined by his music, but by the quiet rebellion that ran through his veins. His journey with the Beatles, though filled with triumph, was also marked by deep personal struggles and emotional scars that he carried until the end.